Hello and welcome to Brandon Smith of Rugby. Today's video is all about the differences between the game of rugby here in Wales compared to Ireland. Currently, looking at the Pro 14, you have two teams which are Irish who have booked their places in the Pro 14 final. Just before that was decided, we saw Ulster and Leinster top of Conference A in top and second respectively, and Munster and Connacht top of Conference B, top and second respectively. Today's video, I was joined by Overlap Rugby to discuss why this was the case, why we were seeing success for Wales on the pitch at national level, but maybe not at regional level, and why it was the complete opposite for Ireland, where they were seeing success for the regions, but maybe not for the national team. As always, do get your thoughts down in the comments down below. It's a very complex situation. And of course, do subscribe. If you haven't done so already, hit the subscribe button. It's free to do. And join us here at Brandon Smith Rugby. It's a great rugby community. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. Thanks to the guys at Overlap Rugby. Do check out what they do. Link down below. Let's have the discussion then about the regional game, because before we started recording, we started to talk about the state of regional rugby here in Wales, because in Wales, we just won the Triple Crown. We are on for a Grand Slam. No disrespect to Italy. We're going to beat them with a bonus point. I'm very confident of saying that. France, again, looks like it's going to be rescheduled, so you'd assume they'd have their players back for that. But again, you know, against the French, our record recently isn't too bad at all. But in Ireland, it's maybe a little bit of the opposite. The national team may be struggling a little bit, but the regions, top two in Conference A and top two in Conference B. Tell me a little bit about that. Why do you think that's the case? Because in Wales, we've always struggled at the regions, bar the Scarlets having a couple of good seasons and the Ospreys having a couple of good seasons. But we've seen Ulster and Leinster and Munster in the past all being pretty consistently at the top. So why do you think that's the reason?
Well, it's a multi-layered answer. I guess going back to the original answer that a lot of folks give for this is that Ireland and Wales, very similar sized countries with similar sized player pools, and the big differential at the formation of professional rugby was the natural split into 4 teams for Ireland, which was very unnatural for Wales. Yeah. So like Leinster, Munster, Ulster, and Connacht are, you know, historical provinces.
Yeah, they used to have kings. There's all kinds of attachments to them.
There's very real Ulster pride and Munster pride and Leinster pride and Ulster pride. And in Wales, it seems that it's a bit different. You've also got the 4 regions, but then you've got people in Pontypridd who don't know whether to support Cardiff or what to do. Like, there's no region in the north of Wales. And from the outside looking in, just based on sort of stuff I've read from fans, it seems like there's a flippance and just a general dislike among a percentage of the Welsh population of the whole idea of regional rugby, and even in some cases the whole idea of Celtic League. Like, there's plenty of folks who prefer the idea of playing in a Premiership against the likes of Bath and those West Country teams in England, sort of derby matches. Yeah, and so it just from the outside looking in, it looks like there's never been the public buy-in,
right?
Which I think is the first layer of it. Like, Ireland fans are well supported by fans on the field and off the field. Yeah, they get plenty of investment, they get plenty of buy-in. And therefore, they've been able to develop strongly from the ground up. Yeah, and all have good academies, spread their players across really well. Always stuff to fight for. It's just a good system. And I think where it starts going wrong for Wales is just that they don't have that buy-in.
Yeah, and then conversely, though, where it goes wrong from Ireland's point of view in terms of filtering all that goodwill and all that success at regional level upwards, is that it's just season on season. It's not always true that everyone's pulling in the same direction to try and benefit the national team. You don't get that. And even going back pre like 09 Grand Slam, there was a very famous Rob Kearney line where he was kind of in preseason talking to the Munster guys, going like, I don't feel like you're just the same man when you're on the team pitch with me for Ireland as you are when you're against me for Munster. And it was a kind of look at yourselves kind of moments. They all cite that team all cited as a landmark moment that turned it around and got them to galvanize together to win that Grand Slam. But it's sometimes when you're looking at just even styles of play, it feels like the national team doesn't necessarily recognize what its attributes are until a little too late. Sometimes you see them do some, like, playing a little bit too much like this team, not quite playing the right kind of tempo. Just like when you compare it to Ronan O'Gara's experience over in New Zealand, where you have, again, similar size of play, similar regions, but they have more of a draft system. There's less animosity, as there sometimes is. There's grumblings about the fact that Leinster Academy have a load of players who are playing for Ulster, playing for Munster, and you can sense there's some people who feel a grievance with that and feel that shouldn't be the case, whereas in New Zealand, that's not true. Like, if you have 5 locks in this province and this lock has none, he goes over there and they bolster it, and it all feeds up to the All Blacks. Whereas sometimes that same sentiment doesn't necessarily seem to be shared in Ireland. And yeah, I just don't think we've quite got the combination right yet. As much as the RFU have done a lot right since the advent of professional rugby and the growth of Leinster, the success of Munster, all of that has been brilliant in terms of getting Ireland to where they're at. I don't think we've quite kind of unlocked how best to make the form of the provinces work for the national team just yet. Hopefully that's to come.
And I'm curious, genuinely curious, Brandon, because it's my only experience of Welsh rugby is just like looking across the water. I don't I don't have the same, I suppose, in-depth experience as you might have. Well, how you might explain the differential between regional rugby and international rugby, and just how, like, why do you think it's not as supported as it might be?
Well, you both alluded to it, of course, when regional rugby came into force in 2003, 2004 here in Wales. Didn't really represent the areas of where people were. And I live up in North Wales, so I have no region. The closest professional side to me is Sale Sharks in Manchester. Wow, so it's a bit of a tough one for me. I support the Ospreys because my grandfather supported Swansea and then started supporting Ospreys when they came in. But it is a massive issue here in Wales. You know, you look at the Liberty, Ospreys play down at the Liberty, 20,000-seater stadium. Again, Swansea will play there on the weekend and fill it out, playing in the Championship. And yeah, when the Ospreys play, when fans, of course, were allowed in, 2,000, 3,000. If it's a derby, maybe 5,000 if you're lucky. And then you look across the pond and you're looking at Thomond Park, or you're looking at the RDS, or you're looking at the showground, and it's full. And it doesn't make sense to me, really. I think here in Wales, we have a lot of fans who, I wouldn't call them fake fans as such, but when the Six Nations comes around, they'll watch all the games. But when the regions, they just won't watch it. And I don't really think that the product of Welsh rugby has really been marketed that well and looks glamorous enough. You may have seen in the news over the past week about Cardiff Blues changing to Cardiff Rugby at the end of the season.
That's right.
I think that's a step in the right direction. Obviously, the Dragons did the same thing a few years ago when they dropped Newport Gwent Dragons and just went with the Dragons. And then Scarlets are just Scarlets, Ospreys are just Ospreys. So I think they're trying to have people be more connected to the region rather than where the region are based as such. But I still think it's a massive issue here in Wales. And I think, in North Wales is a big issue, because where I am, I'm an hour away from Liverpool, 2 hours away from Manchester, huge footballing cities, massive following, you know, and for rugby to really compete with them, I do think a region in the north would be a good idea. But again, I mean, the Welsh Rugby Union is struggling as it is. There were talks of the Scarlets and Ospreys merging a couple of years ago. So there's a lot to be done here in Wales. But I think we are seeing some positives, and lots of players re-signing for the region specifically. So I think the Dragons have re-signed Elliot Dee and Aaron Wainwright this week. We're seeing Reece Priestland come back over. And a few others coming back over from the Premiership. And whether they're earning as much here, I don't know. Maybe the Welsh Rugby Union are definitely going to be supporting with that, but it's got to be a positive. But will people who don't really go watch the regions, will they go and watch them because these players are coming back? I'm not sure. Is that natural association with the club there enough for someone to say, yeah, now I'm going to go and watch my region? I don't think it is. I think it's a big issue for rugby here in Wales.
It takes a lot of hard work, I guess, to get it from a position where they are now to a position where there's sustainable success going on. The good news for Wales, though, is that they're not short of talent. They are perhaps a little stretched financially, probably more so than the IRFU, although the IRFU isn't in perfect shape. So they can't afford sort of mad investment. And when you're sort of running a club in a position where, you know, signing, for example, like RG Snyman or Damien De Linde isn't really a realistic option. You have to be creative. But I definitely think the right idea is to give Welsh internationals every incentive possible to play in Wales.
Yeah.
That's beneficial for all kinds of reasons, not least of which you can see the situation with the Scots, which thankfully has been resolved. But like, you don't want, you know, a half of your squad to be at the behest of Premiership rugby or the LNR in France.
Yeah.
That's a dangerous situation to find yourself in. So it's much, much better to be playing regional rugby domestically in Wales, and it'll help the provinces as well.
Yeah.
But I mean, as far as getting fans in, you feel that it has to be about, you know, building sustained success in the clubs and then getting the support from there to make it sustainable.
That's the only way it builds it. Sure, even Leinster, before they'd won anything, were playing in Donnybrook and only getting like 3,000 odd to the great things. That's not that long ago, but success is kind of what gets eyeballs on. Like you saw, we were mentioning it with France as well. Suddenly, the LNR is more than happy to let the French players out to play French rugby, because they realize, oh, look, France are good now for the first time in nearly a decade, and there are eyeballs on them. And that kind of all feeds down to the club game then, because you're going to be intrigued to watch the likes of Dupont or Cheslin Colby or whatever these marquee players are. It'll take some kind of on-pitch success before the eyeballs return from the Welsh clubs, which is where it's a tough catch-22. Like, is necessarily, like, if you're repatriating a guy who's got nearly 100 caps, are you necessarily getting a huge asset in that who's going to help you win a league? I don't know. Yeah. So it's a tough investment to make. You're going to have to gamble on some of those. But one thing I would say is just the Pro 14 as a competition has got a little stale this year. Certainly, even from what we were saying, our whole coverage of it in the early going was just that there was a bit of a gulf in class in terms of the teams, as well as just a gulf in interest, seemingly, with the different fan bases, and it's desperately static and stagnant and in need of a bit of a change. So maybe with the South African teams coming in, coupled with a bit more investment in the Welsh rugby regions, and then a little bit of success, if they get a big win against the Sharks in South Africa, say, or something, little things like that can be little catalysts for change and for positivity.
Yeah, I think the best blueprint for the Welsh regions to look to for inspiration has to be the Scarlets, Wayne Pivac's Scarlets team that won the Pro 14, that made a European semi-final.
Yeah,
and
they got their ground full that year.
Yeah, exactly. It started with just the Scarlets more or less as they are now. They got a good coach in with a nice idea to play high-tempo rugby, which suits the Welsh players down to the ground. Yeah. They got a load of buy-in and got the best out of a decent crop of players, with one or two exceptional players.
Yeah.
And they got the very best out of them. Like, you've never seen. Steph Evans was magnificent because he was facilitated to play.
Yeah, Johnny McNichol and all these guys.
They built a lovely game, played to their strengths, played at a high tempo, caught teams like Leinster napping, and ended up winning a league. And then the next season they qualified for a European quarter-final, and all of a sudden Parky Scarlets was full and heaving and filled with song. Yeah. And there was the difference that success brings. They couldn't sustain it, unfortunately, for them. They've kind of dipped off. But for regions to look to how to get people inspired, it starts on the rugby pitch, and that involves, you know, it's difficult because you're up against the Irish clubs who have more resources and are way ahead of you in your development. But if you can get everything right, with some good coaching, playing to your strengths, and one or two shrewd acquisitions in terms of who you get. Like, I look at John Porch's very wise acquisition, because Connacht haven't got the money to be splashing on superstars, but they saw this guy and they got him in. And I think one or two of those, good scouting of New Zealand rugby and Australian rugby, and getting guys on the cheap who could be very useful for you, and to maybe inspire the team is the best route forward for all of those provinces, or all those regions. But yeah, for the time being, it's disappointing. But there's a couple of them aren't too far away. I don't think Cardiff are too far away.
I don't think Scarlets are necessarily either. I still think they Scarlets, more so than any of them, are my favourite in terms of having a consistent ethos in terms of how they want to play the game. Like, some seasons they're pretty poor and they can leak a few tries and they don't end up featuring, but they to a man, even when you see a young 20-year-old or 19-year-old line out in the Pro 14 for Scarlets, they tend to play Scarlets rugby, which is a really good attribute in a side as well, to have an identity.
Yeah, I think that's really important. The idea of an identity is massively important. First up, the Ospreys, I think it's not the most attractive style of rugby, but on the whole, it works. I mean, I recently watched us beat Zebra 10 points to 0. and the first score came in the 46th minute, I think, something like that. So
sure we've beaten that crowd 3-0 before.
Yeah, it's something about those Italian teams, especially out in Italy. They just have the worst games.
It can be very ugly going.
They're just horrendous, some of them games, and I do think that's an issue for the Pro 14. Is it an attractive league to watch? Is the level, as you said? Because for me personally, I think that you got Leinster and Ulster, Munster at the top, maybe Leinster just above them. Then below them, you maybe got Ospreys at the minute, maybe Connacht or about at that level. Then when you go down, you maybe got Scarlets and Cardiff Blues. I have no idea what's going on with the Scottish regions this season, because that's a bit bizarre to me.
There's an alternate universe where Finn Russell and Stuart Hogg, who might well be front runners for starting positions in the Lions in their positions, are starting for Glasgow. I mean, that in a nutshell is what's gone wrong with Scottish rugby. They don't have the player base to compete when half of their national squad doesn't play for their regions. Just like the Pro 14 on a whole is not in a healthy place, because as far as I'm concerned, as a Leinster fan watching Leinster this year, I'm not convinced that we're that good a team. I am not convinced that we're front runners for the European Cup. I'm a little more pessimistic perhaps than most Leinster fans, but I don't think we're playing good rugby. I think it's very one-dimensional. It's very brute force. The passing isn't as slick as it once was. I think we're ripe to be found out around quarterfinal or semi-final time in Europe, as we were last year. I'm not convinced. And 10 years ago, we were the best team in Europe, and we still couldn't win this league. Because there was Ospreys teams were great, Munster teams were great, and even Glasgow teams in seasons gone by have been great. That has fallen off a cliff. What's behind us in the league has fallen off a cliff.
The general standard has dipped, and it's one of my bugbears watching the league this year when I hear a commentator describe like a pretty mundane catch as world class, and I have to hear this, and I'm like, let's be real here. I'm watching Benetton v Edinburgh. There's not a lot of world class on show, because I am actually watching Super Rugby Aotearoa, watching a lot of rugby from around the world, and thinking like, no, and even watching the Premiership across the pond, and some of the top tours, and you're just looking at the overall standard of play and thinking, I'm not convinced, as you say, with the whole level of the Pro 14. And then, as Leinster fans, it's kind of a nice position to be in when you're winning every game. But as you alluded to, it's tough to know, like, if we're getting any kind of test or if we're just developing bad habits, because it looks like the way Leinster are playing this season is just kind of Springbok rugby all over the league, where they're just getting a bit of tempo going and just winning every collision against a lot of these teams. And it's very easy to play any kind of rugby you like when that's the way that the platform you're given. Like, I'm not fully convinced that Ross Byrne's a very class 10, but I am convinced that every time he lines out in the league for Leinster, he's got a pack motoring forward and he can kind of do what he likes. So it's very tough to get any of these tests when your domestic comp is, well, a little shy of standard. And just certainly the ongoing critique is there's no relegation, so there's no real stakes. So if you're a team in the position where you're halfway through a season and you're already out of it, or a lot of regions like the Welsh regions finding this season an abridged season in COVID year, you're not featuring in the final now. It's tough to really care about a lot of these games then when you're going through them, and the performances reflect that.
I think we're seeing that with the Dragons, for instance. Again, you mentioned about your game against them, when they just kick the ball out and then they go and lose away to Zebra, and for Zebra, they had no internationals in their squad for that game.
It's unbelievable.
Indeed. It's crazy. Crazy that
the players who were lining up for the Dragons that day, Hodder Williams, Jamie Roberts, people like that, who are internationals. Jamie Roberts, for goodness sake, has played so many games, and he has actually been all right this season, to be honest.